Hi, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Dr. Richard Amaral, and I'm a psychologist here in Ontario, Canada. And today I'm really looking forward to interviewing one of the associates, one of the practitioners at Psychology for Growth, Veronica Lowe. Veronica and I have been working together for many years now, and she's got a lot of great interests, a lot of great skills, particularly in the areas of grief counseling. But one of the interests that Veronica has been focusing on as of late has been on the topic of self compassion. And you hear a lot about self compassion out in the literature out there. And I'm really looking forward to taking more of a deep dive into the topic today. So, Veronica, welcome. Welcome to Psychology for Growth. Welcome to this video.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm a psychotherapist practicing in Ontario, registered with the college. And yes, my interest in self-compassion is probably came from personal perspective, and
Mm.
then researching more about, what is possible for out there for therapists to actually use in practice. I came across mindfulness focused therapy, and from that mindfulness self-compassion practice. And those I've applied in my practice, and I've found tremendous results because of it.
Okay, so it sounds almost like it was just a natural progression, right? In terms
Yep.
of, I guess, the types of intervention. You started with mindfulness and
Mhm.
then found that self compassion was a good way to connect the two or a good progression from it.
Yeah.
Um, so tell me, yeah, what is self compassion in that regard then? How would you
So
define it?
self-compassion is difficult for most people because
Mm,
most people think it's going to be too selfish. You're thinking about yourself, giving yourself kindness and self-compassion. People have no trouble expressing compassion for others. It's almost naturally, genetically evolved so that we feel for others suffering and we want to help them. But when it comes to ourselves, we feel, oh, that's just being selfish and self centered. I don't want to be like that. So most people, unfortunately, do not extend self compassion to self. And that's where
mm,
some troubles can occur, right? Because regardless of who we are, sometime in our life, we're going to feel great sadness, huge anxiety, there'd be grief, trauma, many experiences everybody have. And as we look around, and if we see anybody suffering from any of that, we jump in right away and we're expressing support and kindness. When it comes to ourselves, what tends to happen, however, is we do a lot of self blame, a lot of our resistance to it,
mm.
and we don't really allow ourselves that self compassion. So it came about with clients because, all these great techniques we have, and the clients would work through them and they'd go, rationally, I know I'm not to blame for all of this. I'm not to blame for my anxiety or my depression or my trauma, blah, blah, blah. But they say it doesn't feel that way to me. So they can't reconcile their thinking mind saying, not your fault, it's okay. So that's a compassion part of it. But the emotional side can say, it's okay. We suffer. That is a human condition. So that's when I looked into more of the theory behind it and some of the practices we can apply to ourselves.
Hmm. So yeah, so it's interesting how, and I hear this a lot in my practice, which is like when we see someone in need of help, and let's say we want to offer compassion as one of those techniques or something we do, because I think you're right. It is sort of a. I'm glad you mentioned that point that it's just like a biological, just a natural tendency we have as humans to feel compassion for those in pain. But when it comes to using it on ourselves, we like you were saying, it's when we turn it inward, then we sort of have this resistance.
Yeah.
And I want to add almost like some guilt, probably. Like, why? Who am I to like take care of myself? Who am I to be self-compassionate?
Exactly. We feel it's selfish. We feel if we give ourselves self-compassion, we will be failures even more, because we don't want to let ourselves off the hook. We tend to have that huge critic going, come on, pull your bootstraps up, get on with it. Don't take time to be sorry for yourself. You see,
Mm.
we equate feeling sorry for yourself to self-compassion, which it isn't. So maybe I'll
So
go in more about what self-compassion actually is.
yeah, please do. I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, so self-compassion is really to treat yourself as if a friend would treat you. So I often turn it around and said, what would you say to your friend who's coming to you, telling you that they're so anxious right now? Would you tell them, stop it
Mhm.
and get on with things? That's silly. No, you'd be saying, oh, that's so tough. Oh, you got a big exam. I can understand why you're stressed, right? And so we do that for friends. We don't do that for ourselves. Now, this is a trick though, because then people go, oh, but then I'm just going to let myself off the hook, right? And I'll
Mm.
never accomplish anything. But self-compassion is twofold. There is the kind, nurturing part, and there's what we call the fierce, compassionate part. So that's the part of us who'd say, yes, that's tough what you're going through. Let's look at it. Many people feel the way you do. It's understandable, but what are you going to do about it now? So there's always, it's like the parent who will say, oh dear, Johnny, you failed the test. Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I bet that makes you feel, you know, like you've weren't good enough or something. But you are good enough. But let's see what we could do so that next time you don't fail and don't feel that you're not good enough. So if we kind of put it to patients that if you kind of use that on yourself, you can actually get past that resistance to your own sort of wanting to care for yourself and also move forward in a very motivated way.
Mm. One of the things that stood out for me in what you're saying was this, and I like the example you said as a parent, is this sort of nurturing piece, right? Because when we're looking to help, maybe a relative looking to help a friend, there is this sort of element of like nurture, right? Like I want to sort of really protect them and nurture them, help them to grow. Um, and you're saying that what we would have to do though with self-compassion is those same words, that same language that we would use on somebody else, we then start to use it on ourselves, right?
Right.
And, go on.
And that's what they find is the connect for the rational mind and the emotional mind to get together, because the emotional mind is soothing itself basically, and therefore it can then respond more to the rational mind, because then the rational mind doesn't come across as just facts, these things are happening. The rational mind comes across more as a nurturer. These things are happening, how can we work through them?
Oh, okay, okay. Well, this is a good time then. What you're making me think is I'm going to tie this in with my book, The Promise Wheel. So in the Promise Wheel, I use the acronym PROMISE to describe each letter that I think a person should focus on in order to have a more balanced life. And the letter M stands for mental, the mind. So, and that refers to like the rational piece that you're talking about. Like, how can I think a little more rationally about the problems that I have before me? And, I hypothesize in my book that when you address the letters PROMIS, each representing an area of your life, when you address those, then your emotions is one that are more sort of comforting, some contentment, more, you'll feel better emotionally. But what I'm hearing you say with self compassion is if we actually start with the emotion first, that will influence the thinking. That will influence the letter M, the mind. So by putting attention on letter E, the emotions, you are in fact changing the way you think, the way you look at your problems, the
Mhm.
way you look at this challenge before you.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And that's why it's so strange when people go, why are resilient people self-compassionate? because you think of resilient people are strong, courageous, they get on with things, they get past hard times. But the key ingredient is before they even do any of that, they make sure they do the self-compassion part.
Mm,
That helps
okay.
them recover more and then be able to figure things out better for the future.
Okay. Okay. Um, Now, I would also suspect that sometimes when a person's trying to practice self-compassion, they're going to come across challenges,
Mhm.
right? Especially because, as you mentioned earlier on, when it comes to like focusing on ourselves, we're very resistant. So that like presents a challenge. Like, how can I be more self-compassionate with myself? Um, so what are some of the difficulties a person has in trying to be more self-compassionate? What's a strategy or technique you might recommend, that we use on ourselves to get over that hump and to be okay with this self-compassion?
Mhm. So part of that is mindfulness does come in, right? It's mindfulness,
Mindfulness.
self-compassion. So
Right.
first of all, they have to raise their awareness of what's their inner dialogue in some ways. What are the things they are saying to themselves? What are the things that are almost destructive and making things worse for them, so they have to
Mm,
be aware of that, because if you don't have that awareness, then you can't really create that mindfulness pause to sort of reflect on it and see it more as just, with mindfulness we say they're just thoughts, they're not realities. And in that pause, that's when you can start saying, now how can I apply, say, self-compassion before I progress further? So that's when you sort of go, what would I tell my friend going through what I'm having? And then you
mm,
just think of what you tell your friend. And then I do say, now just turn it around on yourself, you know? And usually most people, when they go, oh, you know, I wouldn't say that to Johnny going through that. And then you just go, then why are you saying it to yourself? And they often go, I don't know. And they
mm,
usually come up with, oh, because it's going to make me weak. And we point back to the fact that a lot of times self-compassion doesn't just leave you with the nurturing self. There is the fierce compassionate part, like the nurturing parent who'd say, what do we do next? Again, it's a mindfulness practice because you have to be seeing yourself in the present to think about the next rather than in your head in the future sometime or in your past.
mm. So the piece around, I like that. So what do we do next? Right. So yeah. So let's say I am sort of starting to practice here. Okay, this is what I would tell Johnny. This is what I would tell my good friend, who perhaps got fired from their job. Or this is what I would tell, a good friend who failed that test or got into a big argument with their spouse. Once I tell that to myself, then I start. Do you notice, like, does a person start to feel better? Do they start to get more at ease, I guess, a little
Mhm.
more I would think also the word forgiveness, like they start to be a little more
Yes.
forgiving of themselves.
Yes, you're quite right, Richard. Forgiveness is an integral part of it as well.
Mm,
That's, when we look at what builds resilience, self-forgiveness and self-compassion, they go hand in hand. So the
okay.
way how I sort of try to explain it to people is when we're faced with some disappointment or some anxious situation, we go through our normal animalistic response or fight, flight, and freeze, right? So when it becomes an internal thing, though, when we're fighting, we tend to do that blaming. It's all our fault, blah, blah, blah. And when we're freezing, we're just ruminating and
Right.
we're just spinning our wheels and so on, right? So instead, we apply instead. How about just doing more self-compassion will work against that blaming part, would stop that blame part. The the next, what are we going to do, will help us stop the ruminating, because now you're actually moving forward rather than just stuck in your
Mm,
thoughts. So it can become very applicable to people, and they find they can use it. That's the main thing. They can use it in their everyday life. Doesn't take
mm.
much to do.
That leads me to another thought around, using on the everyday life. And I'm thinking about using it for like these different challenges that a person
Mhm,
goes through. So a few of the things I'm thinking about, one is I do a lot of work in addictions. And one thing, I find is like someone dealing with an addiction feel a tremendous amount of guilt. And
mhm.
sometimes they will use that particular substance, let's say alcohol or drug, to help medicate for that guilt, right? To help ease the guilt. Or perhaps they'll engage in a problematic behavior like gambling, porn addiction to help with that guilt. But I can also, so I guess that's one thought is like, if I were struggling with an addiction, how can I use it? And the other thing I was thinking about is, if I were the parent or the loved one of somebody who had an addiction, um, is there, so I'm thinking of addictions in general, and then I'm also thinking of something perhaps like trauma. So someone, if a very traumatic event has happened to me, I might start to blame myself
Mhm.
because of what happened. Maybe if I hadn't done this, then this person wouldn't have
Right.
mistreated me. So
Yeah.
those are the two areas. I'm wondering if you can just
Yes.
talk about that.
Yes, and you're quite right. What we try to do in compassion therapy is we try to shift from the shame and blame part. I'm, it's all my fault, blah, 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 to the guilt. We actually prefer guilt, because
Oh.
guilt is then, rather than it's imposed on it, you're imposing it on yourself. So then you can get a certain amount of agency, right? You can sort of go, well, what can you do about it again, right? If you don't want to feel guilty, what is your next approach? But that's
Mm.
all really prefaced by the whole kindness part first. You must start off with the kindness part.
So you start off with kindness, being kind to yourself. And do you find that the kindness will lessen the guilt or maybe even keep it further at bay? Is that what
Yes,
you?
it causes that sort of, again, that mindfulness gap, I like to call it. It causes not a disassociation, but it creates a distance between the entanglement that you feel with that sort of emotional state, right? The blame, shame, and all of that. It gives you a certain perspective. That's what we feel. Self-compassion gives you a perspective that almost
Mm,
makes you less identified with it, right? Again, it's the same idea. If this is a friend going through this, so there's a bit of distance between the whole entanglement. It's me and, that whole fusion thing. So instead, this is me doing this for myself. You know, what would I say to myself? How would I respond to myself? And like we do for kids or for friends, how are we going to move forward? After all the active listening you do for friends and kids, they always say, so what do I do now? And when they're asking that, then oh, this is time for movement to happen.
mm. Time for movement, time, I guess, to move towards your goal. What
Yeah.
is that movement? Could you?
The movement towards what would it like you to have happen instead,
Okay.
right? So it's
Okay.
always, it's one thing to just feel guilty that I'm drinking and so on and so on, but it's like, so what steps can you take so you don't do that? Feel the
Got it.
guilt and so on and so on.
Oh,
Because yes, we can again ruminate on guilt and blame. We won't move. We're stuck in that emotional state. Our thinking mind is saying, you can do this, get over it, blah, blah, blah. But our emotional state is stuck in the guilt. So you do have to go in there with the nurturing part is the first part that creates that distance from it, because they don't feel as entangled, as I said. and fused with all those ideas, and then they can then move forward.
Hmm.
They're more receptive, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I'm just processing what you're saying. That's all very deep. I really like it actually. The because and I'm sort of putting it in the context of like some cognitive behavior theories and therapy where, if I want to change how I feel, I focus on changing the way I think, or I can focus on the way I behave, the way I act. What I'm hearing you say though is that start with this mindfulness piece where you become aware of this emotion. We become aware of this guilt, become aware of this feeling of shame. And then that's the mindfulness. So we become aware of it. Once you become aware of it, you engage in this sort of compassionate dialogue with yourself, where you're kind. And and I could see that having a huge impact on the behavior, on what I do next versus, yeah, okay, well, that I completely see that, at least in the context of addictions. Because, so for example, sometimes when I'm working with addiction, I'll pay attention to, I'll ask them, okay, why don't you notice what you were feeling before you use this drug, before you drank, you know? And then I often come from a harm reduction perspective. So I'll say, okay, where can we cut back? If you wanted to sort of reduce your use, reduce the harm, where would you look at? Where could we start? But now I'm realizing is that I'm coming from focusing on the behavior. But after hearing you talk, it's like, well, maybe if I take a few moments, if the client and I take a few moments, just focus on this sort of awareness and focus on this compassion. That if I were compassionate with myself, how would that then influence
Mhm.
the behavior afterward? I like that.
Yeah. So
Um,
one of the
yeah, go on.
techniques I do have for, say, with addictions or trauma is I always ask them to imagine. Imagination is a great tool. Imagine what they would think the perfect friend or nurturer. What's their personality? How are they supportive? What are things that they say? So I flush them out as much as I can, because unfortunately a lot of addiction and trauma, there wasn't much nurturing and support in their earlier years. So we come up with the perfect nurturer. That's what we call them, right? And we sit there, we list out the character. We might even do a bit of meditation and say, can you imagine what that character would be like? And now a lot of people go, oh, that's all mumbo jumbo. Now you're going to get into guided imagery.
Mhm.
And I go, listen, it does get through to you, because imagery is such that the mind does almost feel it's real.
Right.
If this perfect nurture is described in this wholesome way, you can almost bring up this perfect nurture at times, right? When you're wanting to grab a drink or, go on another gambling site, you sort of go, wait, you've got this perfect nurture. What would that perfect nurture be telling you now? And they often find it's enough to make them then start using all the other techniques, as you said, CBT, thought, all those thought
Yeah.
replacement and all of that. And they then act on it.
Right. Right. So this nurturing self will influence the
Mhm.
next steps, the actions, the behaviors. I like that. Um, Veronica, what does the research say around self-compassion and this use
Yeah,
on
well,
ourselves?
there's tons of research being done, and they do go into the neurobiology of it all, of why it works,
Neurobiology. Okay.
because of it's when we actually have this response to suffering, whether it's others or ourselves, we actually activate a part in our brain that sort of has this sort of almost effect to make us want to go into action, right? It's the alert response or something like that. But then, almost, thank goodness, nature instilled in us to keep going. We get a little boost, the
Mm,
good feelings you have when you help somebody out, or even what you feel when you give a homeless person of food or money. There's that, oh, you can't help but feel. And that is good old um, oxycontin, oxycodone,
Uh, uh, uh,
sorry. Yeah, it's the
Oxytocin.
one for
Yeah.
oxytocin. That's it.
Yeah.
And so that's when the dopamine comes out. So that's a feel good feeling. So this
Right.
is where they find that when we actually do that nurturing part, that's what's being activated, which will help us then become a bit more stable, grounded,
Mm.
then follow through with thinking and so on. So there's tons of research. Paul Gilbert, as you mentioned, Dr. Christian Neff, those have done great research. You can always look it up. I can't quote them all, but there
Yeah,
are
no,
tons.
sure. And I will put that in some of these show notes down below
Yeah,
the video.
yeah.
It's great. And I love that how that behavior and that sort of internal dialogue actually changes the way the brain is working. It actually changes the release, the production of some of these neurotransmitters. It's fantastic.
Hmm, hmm.
Veronica, that's I really appreciate this. Thank you. This was excellent, very
Welcome.
informative. And for you, all of you out there watching this video, thank you for sticking around. If you would like to have a session with Veronica, just check out our website, www.psychologyforgrowth.com. Click on the tab that says Our Associates, and you'll see Veronica's profile there. You can leave an email and we'll book an appointment. Veronica, thank you again. Thank everyone for watching and take care of yourselves. And I hope this piece of psychology helps with your development, your healing, and your growth. Take care.
Thank you.